given that I come from down under, let me start at the end. And where's the button? There? No, that's not working, so that one probably is. Thank you. Thought you'd enjoy that. I want to say thank you to Sandra for sponsoring me to come here back to the States at a meeting last week in Washington, and now here. It's just been absolutely wonderful. The sponsors of this seminar, and Sandra just related those, to Michigan State University. I tried as I could. I eventually became a Spartan. I mean, I actually follow the baseball. Or the basketball. I never followed it when I was here, but I follow it now I'm home. And I really feel part. It's just absolutely incredible, except last night's loss was a bit of a blow. There you go. But this university was extraordinary for me because I had retired in Australia and was literally invited to come here. And I mean, there's nothing more soothing to the ego than be invited, particularly when you're a has-been at your own institution. The reason why I was given an Order of Australia, I think, was because they knew I was then moving to the United States. So that was easy. I also want to acknowledge, and it's always slightly perplexing to me, why the sort of people on whose shoulders I've stood aren't better known. But I guess that the sort of journey that I've been on has been extraordinarily eclectic. And more than 80% of the scholars, recent scholars, without going back to the Greeks and the Romans, but the recent scholars, 80% of them are from this country. And as I've reeled them off over the years, and I'm not going to do it now, but as I've reeled them off here in various seminars that I've been involved with, people have said, oh, who's that? Oh, I didn't know. Oh, And there really is an extraordinary rich intellectual climate in this country. And without any apologies to the University of Michigan whatsoever, it's really alive and well in Michigan State. What it lacks, and I'm catching a plane tomorrow, so... Yes, right. What it lacks, it seemed to me, all the time I was here, is a cohesive intellectual framework. A world view that would bring together 2,500 faculty, or however many they are, around a notion that provides the sort of leadership that back in the 1860s, when the land grant movement first started, would provide that sort of leadership again. And I say that because, as Sandra indicated, I've been around a bit. I've spent a lot of time working with universities in lots of other countries in the world, and they are bereft of ideas. A point I shall return to in just a moment. And the reason why that's serious is that when I was born in 1939, when I was born then, there was 2.1 billion people on Earth. 2.1. There are now 6.6 and growing rapidly. That is an extraordinary statistic. And everything else that I'm about to say, does this happen often? I'll go and stay on the streets. I've never had such attention. It's wonderful. So here's my dedication then to all the American scholars on whose shoulders I've stood over the years, and a glance at any of my more substantial papers. I've actually only ever written one, but I keep doing it over and over again. But there are a lot of American scholars in there to whom I owe a huge credit. I also owe huge credit to Alexei, who was a New York cab driver, who on my very first visit to the United States 25 years ago gave me what became the mantra for the rest of my academic career. This is how I interpreted it. Do you know what I mean? Now, I thought this was an intellectual invitation, because I actually hadn't a clue what it was that he was talking about before that. Partly I hadn't a clue because he was talking about New York and I'd never been there before, but also I hadn't a clue what he was talking about. I mean, so I said no. And he sort of screeched to a halt and said, you know, what do you mean no? I said, well, I actually don't. And I thought, you know, this is a wonderful, why don't we go around asking people what do they mean when they say something? Now, Australians aren't known for being polite. And so it was a wonderful sort of way by which you could create an educational program by saying, okay, all you ever have to do is do you know what I mean? And you have to ask the question, no. Or if you do, then you expand on it. And I shall come back to this issue because it is absolutely central to the message, because most of the time, I would argue, within the academy anyway, we are making statements in languages and different communities that other communities don't understand, even within the academy. And certainly between the academy and elsewhere, it is meaningless. Meaningless. Now, I'm a systemist, and that means that I take a three-dimensional view of the world. As Sandra said, I'm not into systems per se, although they're useful, but I'm a systemist. And the fundamental issue with that is that we see everything, every issue, every phenomenon, every conversation in three dimensions. The system of interest, so whatever it is, it's just some messy, complex issue, or it's a railway system, or in my case, one that's really important at the moment, the pensions. That's a system, if we want to call it that. But it doesn't exist other than the fact that we bring it into being. This is an important point. What brings it into being is what I refer to as a knowing subsystem. In other words, human beings bring systems into existence. They also bring into existence the notion that the system boundary bounds it from some other system which is bigger. And the notion then is to say, well, all of those, conceptually at least, interact with each other. So that, at any given moment, we would do well to look at interactions rather than phenomena, issues, things per se. Because one of the things that's intrigued me over the years, initially as a biologist, and I was a parasitologist once, who was really interested in how parasites knew where they were. This is a really interesting question. The parasite I studied lived in the large bowel of sheep. If it didn't know where it was and got lost, it would miss the host. And that's pretty disturbing. If you're a parasite, you wake up and the sheep's gone, as it were. So the notion of knowledge emerging through interconnectedness is, again, a vital part of what it is that I want to say. Here is a non-systemic view of the so-called trifecta. And Paul Thompson was the one who came up with this title, and he's not here. Sadly, he's going in for some surgery tomorrow. But Diane's here, and you can tell him that he really just said, this is a good idea, and then left. And Sandra said, oh yeah, that is a good idea, and she also left. So I have this title. I have no idea what it means, but I thought, well, it's three things: food, health, and agriculture. Now, again, to a systemist, there are three non-logical types. Agriculture is a human activity. Food is a commodity, a thing, an output of agriculture. And health is a state of human beings. A way to bring them together from a systemist would be to say, well, they're all discourses. They're all people talking about stuff. And in that way, they can indeed then be integrated. But bearing in mind the three dimensions, we don't just bring the three together. We bring the three together, we think about their interactions, and we embed them in an environment. Now, in the earlier version, in that one, there are weak leakages that have developed over the years. Certainly when I became a Dean of Agriculture, at my institution there was a Dean of Food. He was supported by the Heinz Company and didn't have a lot to say to me, and I didn't have a lot to say to him, which was a great pity, so we really had very, very weak linkages, other than to acknowledge that a lot of the stuff that came out of agriculture was food. In my country, a lot of it isn't. At this stage when we started, we had something of the order, and I think we'll come to it in a minute, 8 million people or something of that order, and we had 180 million sheep. You know, there was just sheep everywhere. We have slightly fewer now, but 180 million sheep is a lot of sheep. And, you know, with only that small number of people, and we don't like eating sheep all that much, so we sell wool. And wool is at its peak when there is a war in a cold climate because of uniforms. So the major marketing strategy for the Australian Wool Corporation ought to be, go start a war somewhere in a cold climate and have them die slowly, so they need lots of uniforms. Now when you say that to wool producers, they're aghast. And you say, but that's what you did. And they say, but that's morally repugnant. And you say, yes it is, but you did it. That's going to come, and we're going to revisit that little issue there. In terms of health, there was a medical school, but it wasn't in our institution, it was away. And the interesting thing about that particular medical school was that it was very young. It was only a year or so old when we started all this, which was 1978. I haven't said that. And it decided it would have a medical school dedicated to health rather than disease. And the Australian Medical Association got really upset by that and put enormous pressure on them. Said, how do you make money out of health? He said, well, you actually save money by not having disease. And that was one step too far. So after a few years, that medical school slowly phased out and went back to being a medical school. That's a cautionary tale. So there were these sort of weak linkages, agriculture to health. Well, we had things like bird flu and swine flu and things like that. That's obviously a direct connection between agriculture and people's health. We had connections between food and health to do, particularly with things like obesity, which I see is a real interesting topic here in this country at the moment. I am obese and have been ever since I was born, I think, by my index. Here's the three environments then, the three levels, as it were, with the red nose in the middle. And the red nose is an extremely important part of this discussion. In there are a whole lot of different discourses. All I've done is identify 4 that I think are incredibly important in terms of the agriculture, food, health nexus. Because what happens, it seems to me, is that there are huge conflicts within and between those 4 different discourses. And they are what I refer to as epistemic conflicts. In other words, they are functions of world views. Now, the amazing thing to me, after 40 years of being an educator and travelling the world, is that I have yet to find a curriculum that focuses on epistemic transformation. In other words, even surfacing the idea that we have a worldview, let alone what comprises it, or what implication there is by holding to a particular worldview. As some wag once said, we all have a worldview, trouble is we don't know it. Well, not only do we know that we've got one, but we get very defensive when it's challenged without knowing, therefore, why we get so angry. Now, this too is incredibly important, and here's my assertion at the central part of this particular thesis. I will argue that it is the profound differences in our worldviews, let's call them epistemes because it's a nice word, that lie at the heart of the majority of the conflicts across this agriculture, food, health, and I'm going to call it a system because by now you've grasped the idea that simply because I've said that it is. You can't fall over it. Larry Bush used to talk about the John and Jane story. Here's a system, John. Run, system, run, said Jane. I'm with that. The profound differences between people's worldviews, I believe, are at the heart of the matter. Now, the fact that people don't know they've even got them makes the whole idea, therefore, of reasoned debate about issues extraordinarily difficult. So, what happens is that the idea of discussion between 2 interested and committed parties in a sense of equal dialogue or a dialectic, and I'll come back to that word in just a minute, has yielded to the idea of a polemic. And from afar, from Australia, and again, bearing in mind I'm catching the plane tomorrow morning, I have to say that since I've been coming here, since 1985, the level of polemics in this country has reached a level which those of us who don't live in the United States but turn to it for leadership despair. The notion that people now stick a stake in the ground and say, that's what I hold to, and I oppose anybody else who has any other different worldview. The tragedy of this, and this is a true story, and it has incredible significance for the future of my country, the immediate future, is that unlike you, with your tripartite form of government, we have a Westminster system. So our Prime Minister is the head of the government. The opposition's role is to sort of dialectically help improve the quality of governance. We had, until very recently, a head of an opposition who had been, in the previous Conservative government, the Minister for the Environment, and surprisingly within that government, had argued for us doing something about carbon emissions and climate change. He's a multi-millionaire, and I guess he felt he could afford to say that sort of thing, so it didn't matter if he got chucked out of the government. He became leader of the opposition when the head of that party not only lost the election but lost his own seat, which was a cause for great glee for us as a conservative. He stayed in for about 18 months trying to compromise with the Social Democrats who are in power around carbon emission trading scheme. And the Conservatives turned on him and chucked him out. And we now have had for the last few weeks, a leader of the opposition who upon appointment said, my role is to oppose, period. We didn't say period because that's an American word. He said full stop, but it means period. Full stop's actually more meaningful, isn't it, when you think about it? Full stop, pum, punto. Now, in saying that, he, in one phrase, one sentence, destroyed the very notion of deliberative democracy as I understand it. It wasn't said in a dialectical sense. In other words, our job in opposition is to help clarify and ask penetrating questions that will, if you will, to take the idea of Humberto Maturana from Chile, that conflict is mutual negation. Mutual negation. The only way forward is to find new worlds together. I love that. I think that's fabulous. That's from a cognitive scientist. Polemic, on the other hand, says, I don't give a damn what you think. This is what I think. End of story. I'm not even prepared to open up the topic. So we now have a leader of the opposition who represents, let's say, something slightly less than 50% of the voting population, who sees his job as killing democracy. Now, this is extremely frightening given the situation that I am about to explore with you. What I want to do, with your permission, is to look back a few years, because in the end I want to look forward. But I want to give you an indication of what it is that I confronted in 1978. I was appointed to this funny little institution. It was a mere 1,000 students on the outskirts of Sydney. It had been put there in 1891 at a time almost coincident with the fact when all the farms moved over the mountains. So all the farming land which had been there to feed Sydney, they all went over the mountains and sort of left this funny little college all by itself. And it made this bizarre decision not to be an agricultural science institute, but to be an agricultural technology institute. Now that's, in my opinion, the worst of the worst worlds. So that you have a whole lot of students who are extremely good at knocking things down and ploughing things and drilling holes and stuff like that, but no idea what it is they're doing. And that indeed is the story of Australian agriculture. I'm going to illustrate that. In 1978 then, I become a dean, and I'm surrounded by people who tell me how to write curricula. And I say, well, I'm not particularly convinced by that. I had just spent 2 years in Latin America working for FAO, and had been convinced of the notion of development rather than agriculture qua agriculture. In other words, to put agriculture in a different context. So I said, let's look at what's happened in Australia over the last 25 years and see if we can pick up some trends. See if there's something in there that tells us we've got to do things differently, not just simply add more subjects. So we did. On the face of it, those 25 years looked extraordinarily good. That the livestock situation, we'd gone from 175 million to 183 million sheep. We'd gone from 28 million cattle to 35 million cattle or whatever, and everything was hunky-dory. What had really happened is a fourfold increase in the area cropped in this period. Now, 50s through to the 70s, you'll figure out quite quickly, also included the 60s. And the 60s was a time, unlike this country where you had civil rights, we just picked on anything to pick on. Remember, we have a convict background. So if there's a fight somewhere, we go and join it. And that's true of the Vietnam War in this case, also the Korean War, and we sold all our wool. And also, this of course was post-World War II, so there was enormous immigration. And just to put those figures there, these are trend lines of course, but just give you the actual idea of the scale of this, we went from 8.5 million people in the early 1950s to 14 million. You know, that's almost double in this short period. The world went up at about the same pace. Actually, it wasn't double, it was 65, 66%. And they both more or less went up at the same pace, from 2.5 billion to 4.2 billion. Now, one of the things you have to do as a Dean of Agriculture is defend agriculture to some extent. So I went around the country saying, isn't this good? Look, you know, we can have all these people living in the world now because they eat. And people said to me, well, that's not necessarily a good thing, is it? Yeah, of course, look what our farmers are doing. Well, of course, my tongue was in my cheek. No, it wasn't a good thing, because this is the cost of doing that. As the economists looked at it, of course, they said, well, not only are we increasing in production, but more importantly, we're increasing in productivity, the efficiency with which we produce things, and the reason we have to do that is because the terms of trade, the economic conditions under which farmers are deteriorating. So, in the face of this, you had to do this, but in spite of that, net farm income declined. So in some senses, it was like a treadmill. No matter how fast farmers ran, they were standing still, or, as we shall just see now, losing. The number of farms held out with a slow decline for a while, and then started to precipitously drop. So here we are now, massive increase in crops, smaller number of farms. Unlike the United States, we do not have large corporate agricultural interests. Basically because the land is so unproductive, it's not particularly profitable. Furthermore, the Commonwealth owns huge hunks of it. Here we have the productivity, terms of trade, net farm income nexus. But hey, if you're going to increase crops and get rid of people, as we'll see also in a minute, you go into indebtedness. Interest rates at this time, here, were 19%. That's a fair, high interest rate. So farmers were borrowing money. Not only were they increasing in terms of indebtedness, but they were facing these extraordinarily high rates which they couldn't service because their net farm income was declining. And their role in the economy, both internal economy and export economy, was declining too. Therefore, obviously, the political power was also decreasing. As we cropped in areas where we should never ever have cropped, then the biophysical degradation, illustrated by empirical data, but also by the number of papers that were beginning to appear in scientific literature and so on, just was going up exponentially. We introduced bizarre crops, bizarre for us, cotton. Now there's a really clever crop to bring into Australia, an arid, dry place. Oh, we'll have cotton and we'll irrigate. We've got one river of any consequence in Australia. One river. The rest of it's desert. Then someone said, well, I know, we could grow rice. That's also an extremely intelligent crop to grow in Australia. You know, there above us is Thailand, the Philippines, Indonesia. They're all pretty good at growing rice. But no, we thought we'd grow rice as well. So, a bit like you, we started to use rivers to such an extent that in the end they actually didn't reach the sea. And the sea where it enters is a city called Adelaide. And they're getting more and more dehydrated as a group of people because the water just doesn't reach them anymore. Oh, and then someone said, I know, wine industry would be good, that'd be good, you know, irrigated grapes. Fabulous. So here we go. Rural unemployment, boom. We bring in machines, we bring in fertilizers, we bring in capital equipment, and we replace labour. So labour goes down, then of course the population in rural areas goes down. Now, none of this is particularly new. I mean, it's all been recorded over the literature forever. Here we have rural society deterioration. We have breakdown. Ours is a very big country. The farms are very large. Therefore, the social interaction gets smaller and smaller. The small villages get, in the end, the school goes and the bank goes, and then the local store goes and the hairdresser goes, and the town just dies. And so we have huge areas in Australia now without any settlement in terms of areas at all. So we had regional towns starting to develop rather than the small villages that we had before. This is 1978. What was really interesting at this time also was, for the first time, Australian farmers were undergoing a psychological stress that they couldn't identify. Up till then, they'd been the goodies. The country developed, as they say, on the sheep's back. We'd made our wealth through wool, through farming. But now the citizens were saying, yes, but some of the things you do are basically cruel. And we had the burgeonings of a animal rights movement, animal welfare, that the citizens, of the urban citizens, and we are 90% urban, so a huge block of people were beginning to say, we actually don't like what you're doing out there. We don't like it from the point of view of the animal. We don't like it from the point of view of the landscape. We don't like it from the point of view of the environment. Furthermore, as consumers, we're being exposed to pollution because you've got pesticides and inorganic fertilizers and all sorts of other stuff that's going on out there. There was also, at this stage, we had a social democrat government in who had given Aborigines the vote. Now, this is pretty extraordinary, isn't it? They've been there for 40,000 years. Europeans arrived 200 years earlier, and it took 200 years before they actually got around to giving the Aboriginals a vote. They still had no land, so in essence they had no rights other than to vote. And then they had to vote, because we have a law in our country about compulsory. So they were fined. So there's an Aboriginal living out in the middle of the desert somewhere or other who now has the vote. Whoopee, freedom, you're fine, you didn't vote. It took 3 days to get in. Too bad. So there were tensions now that rural people generally, and that was being then exposed through all sorts of extraordinary substance abuse, particularly amongst the Aboriginals, with alcohol, with petrol sniffing and other substances, and violent interpersonal abuse, women abuse, child abuse, and so on. So we had a cultural fragmentation as well as a social fragmentation. Now, if you're a Dean of Agriculture facing all of this, you have two choices. Well, three, really. One, you resign, and I wasn't prepared to do that. The second one is to say, well, we'll do what we've always done and reduce this down to little bits. So we'll give the sociologists various parts to do, and the economists and the production people, and that's fine. Or the third one is to say, how do you grasp all this messy complexity? What do you have to do to make meaning? Do you know what I mean? To actually try and figure out what's happening in such a way that you can engage with the population and be useful. So rather than sitting back and saying, you know, we've got now better pesticides for your cotton, we now did start to engage in the debate of what do we as Australian citizens think about growing cotton. And that became an agenda for our debate and our education. Much later I came across the work of Ulrich Beck, and I think this sums it up beautifully. We are concerned no longer exclusively with making nature useful or with releasing mankind from traditional constraints, but also and essentially with problems of techno-development itself. Modernisation is itself, he said somewhat optimistically, becoming reflexive. And it was somewhat optimistically because I don't think it has. In other words, it's not just the technologies and the stuff that we do, but it's the very process of industrialisation or modernisation itself. Now, over the succeeding 20-odd years at Hawkesbury, we tried to put onto the national agenda conversations about this, how we live our lives. Let me leap ahead now a number of years. Just before I left Australia, a couple of weeks back, the Prime Minister came onto national television and he said, you know, I've got a dilemma. My fellow Australians, I wonder where he got that from. My fellow Australians, he said, we've got a bit of a problem. He said, we don't have enough people working to support the population which is healthier and well-fed and ageing. So we're going to go from 22 million to 36 million over the next 15 years. You've got to be joking. This is a social democrat. Faced with all of the deteriorations around him in every single parameter, we're going to increase our population. Terrific. We are the 5th largest contributor in terms of carbon emissions per capita in the world, with a population of 22 million. Unbelievable. Let me go now to argue. Oh, I meant to change the order of these and I didn't. Go away. The issue of technical control. We were at a meeting last week which admittedly was about science and technology in the service of the environment. So it was science and technology led, so that was, you know, fairly obvious that we shouldn't have been critical about it. But it was just all technical fix. Silver bullet stuff, it will come. So what we will do is, instead of using oil, we'll use windmills and we'll use this and we'll use... Not one person talk about, why don't we think about the way we live our lives? There were 1,000 people at this conference. Nobody said, let's rethink this whole process of industrialisation and modernisation and so on. Nobody. Nobody mentioned China or India. Now, we sit at the foot of China and just over to the east of India, which is more than a third of the world's population between those two. They are saying, as we all saw in Copenhagen, and one could argue perfectly rationally, we would like to be the way you are. But to get to where we are, they have to be industrialized. To be industrialized, they will need energy. To get energy in a place where the peak oil production is probably now or soon, they're going to turn to other fuels. They turn to Australia because we produce coal. Isn't that brilliant? We have an extraordinarily low unemployment rate, 5.2% and falling. Why? Because we sell coal to China, who pays us, and so we're booming along. Thank you very much. So the other part of the Prime Minister's dilemma was, and we will continue to sell coal to China. And you think, well, this is really good news, isn't it? Thank God I'm leaving the country for a week or so. It might have sorted itself out by the time I get back. So we're going to increase the population, we're going to stress absolutely everything that we've got, and we're going to not only industrialise ourselves, but industrialise China and India as well. Now, the culture of technical control is alive and well in most universities around the world because we're so good at it. We are really good at science, but it translates so often, and Sandra alluded to this, in terms of a culture of technical control. We control through science and technology. The people who have the power are the people who have money who made it through science and technology. And the culture of technology values fact over value, privileges fact over value. So we really want to remove values from debates. Well, you can't do that, it's bizarre. Instrumental rationality over communicative rationality. In other words, the expert knows the answer instrumentally, and we're not going to enter into communication and have an emergent understanding of what, or judgment about what it is we might do as a citizenry. We value analysis over synthesis. We love pulling things apart. That's the easy way to do it. How do parasites know where they are? So you find that out, then what? Fragmentation over integration, same thing, larger scale. Individualism over communalism. The individual reigns, rules. Productionism over sustainabilism. And teaching over learning. And all of those have phenomenal implications, I would argue, around the question, so what's to be sustained? It's no longer just agriculture, of course, we're talking about the trifecta. So what's to be sustained? Population growth? Or if we are to slow population down, does that mean let's just withdraw health? Which has implications with healthcare. How many countries in the world have universal healthcare? And name one that doesn't. I won't pursue that. What's to be sustained? Well, what's to be sustained, I would argue, is a way of making meaning in such a way that everybody feels that they're contributing. In other words, that there is a vibrant democracy where everybody feels that they have a say in this particular case, the nexus between those three. The way the land should be farmed, the way food should be produced and made available, food security in other words, and the relationship between food and health are all issues that the citizenry really wants to get a grasp on and deserves to. How's the judgment call to be made? Let's go back to the middle here. There they are, the four major constituencies in this discourse: business, lay citizens, experts and governance. And I talk about lay citizens rather than civil society because that the expert makes greater distinction with the lay citizen. Because if we just had civil society, experts would see themselves as that, and the literature uses these terms. And here we go. We cannot have sensible conversations across that network because we have conflicting meaning-making frameworks. Here are four that are profoundly different. And I'm going to explore very briefly in a minute why they're different. We've only had agriculture in Australia for 200 years. Aboriginals didn't farm. We didn't have any grazing ruminants. And kangaroos are exceptionally hard to herd, believe you me. We didn't have any productive grains. Our grasses are very strange. They shatter. And anyway, the Aboriginals were quite happy doing what it is they did, and they did it for 40,000 years. Isn't that sustainable? When farmers first came to Australia, then they pioneered. This was back in the late 18th century. Science really hadn't got a grip anywhere. And so they did what it is they did, using European logic to farm in Australia. Wrong. They continue to do it. Wrong. Production was the emphasis of science that came along and said, well, you can right the wrong a bit. If you know enough about science, we can actually farm better, and sure enough, we did. We have. We continue so to do. But at the huge cost that we've already illustrated. Productivity said, well, we're not concerned simply with the small bits, we're actually concerned with wholeness. Let me make a distinction here between whole picture and big picture. People often say, well, people who are interested in systems or systemics are big picture people. No, we're not. We're whole picture people. We put boundaries, and we are very conscious when we put a boundary that we put it there. So we make judgments about it. Big picture is whatever it is, but it's not what we do. And then the whole idea of persistence in terms of what do we want to persist? Or as Paul Thompson says, what should be allowed to persist? That's a moral question. So issues to do with giraffes and tigers and koala bears and human beings are all in this mix. What should be allowed to persist is, as we shall see, a question. Here is a graph that I drew in 1980 that illustrated those four, and at that time I was arguing these are profoundly different worldviews, each one because they actually have different factors. This one was about fundamental operations, assessed by efficacy, technological innovations by effectiveness, systems optimization, efficiency, both ecological and economic, and finally systemic integrations, which was ethical defensibility. In other words, could you actually say this is what you should be doing, and to make an assessment about when you're not, you're doing it badly? I'll go through this very quickly. This bit is where I think the essence lies. The academy, I will argue, vociferously focuses on teaching, not on learning. The process of learning is making sense of your environment in order to do something. Teaching is somebody else telling you that. John Dewey is one of my heroes, one of my American scholars on whose shoulders I stand, who made the point about experience. But genuinely, the only sound learning is that when you genuinely experience something or another. And I think that is being manifest here now in the United States, as many other places, where as yet we haven't experienced the existential shock that war brings. 9/11 was one, but the response was a sort of, I would argue, instrumental technical response. Let's go to war. That's not a particularly considered systemic response. So the idea then is that we don't do that neutrally. We make sense of our world through a particular perspective of which we are usually unaware. And that's the epistemic bit, which consists of four fundamental philosophical categories, if you will, or more. But these four are really useful. Belief about the nature of nature. In other words, what is the nature of reality? Now, this is not going to dive into the philosophical notions of metaphysics or the nature of nature, but everybody has a view of the nature of nature. Some people believe that it actually has an integrity, and we are part of that integrity. Others, like many early ecologists, put human beings aside and said human beings disturb the ecology, well, in which case that's another notion of nature. Nature has an integrity according to some, not according to others. So there are fundamental differences, ontological differences between the nature of nature. The second one, the nature of knowledge, so-called epistemologies, that there are people who believe the only knowledge worth knowing is that which is provable empirically, the objectivism of science, versus those who say, well, there are other knowledges as well which are really, really valid upon the context in which they're set. The third one, the one that we really don't like exploring all that much, beliefs about the nature of human values. That includes ethics, but also aesthetics and other dimensions of the way we value things. And finally, beliefs about the origin of the universe, and this is of particular interest and importance to some of the work that I do working with Aboriginals, because this is the first thing that we have to enter. And quite frankly, their cosmology in general terms is so fundamentally different from mine but it makes it exceptionally difficult to make much progress at all. But unless we address it, we go back into the mutual negation of conflict. Just very briefly, here are some pompous words. Technocentricity means that we focus on reductionism and objectivism. This is where our education sits, mainly. It's relatively easy to do, and because we can measure it and calculate it and predict upon it and model upon it, then it's really neat. We can make some assumptions, furthermore, using objective knowledges of holism. And the difference between holism and reductionism, the way I use it, is simply an ontological difference about the nature of nature. Wholes have properties that are unknowable from a study of their parts, holism, or they do not. So wholes have what are known as emergent properties. You bring hydrogen, oxygen together under the right conditions, you get water. That's not surprising. You get wet. That's surprising. There was nothing about liquid hydrogen or liquid oxygen that gave you any sense of wetness. So wetness is an emergent property. And it only happens through experience. So a technocentric view of the world then goes back to those three, being seen as almost independent or with weak linkages between them. And the sort of idea then of development using that perspective are these various metrics here. Technical feasibility, economic viability, social desirability, and political acceptability. That's what we do and have done for 250, 300 years. With this one, we have to add all of these other ones plus more. Ecological responsibility, ethical defensibility, cultural sensitivity, and spiritual sensibility. They're not easy to do. And I want to argue that unless we're prepared to engage in conversations that embraces all of that, then the academy is redundant. Just putting in some words, arguing that this is actually a system then of knowing and learning. And the fundamental sort of end piece almost is to say the good news is that we can develop our worldviews once we recognize we've got them. The work of 3 American educational psychologists in particular, William Perry, Marcia Salner, and Karen Kitchener, and then oodles of others since then have illustrated that this is perfectly possible. And in fact, if you're lucky, it happens accidentally. But you've got to be lucky. An important point is that moving to there embraces there. So it's not that any one of these is better than the other, except that this one sets a context for the others. So I'm certainly no anti-reductionist. I think reductionism is absolutely marvellous, but it needs to be contextualised. What is it we're actually trying to do here, and does it make sense in terms of possible consequences overall? An American, Jack Mesereau, sums it up quite nicely. We transform our frames of reference, our epistemes, our own and those of others, by becoming critically reflective of their assumptions, aware of their context, the source, nature and consequences of taken for granted beliefs. In other words, there's hope, but we have to address it. And I would argue that if we really mean higher education, we mean epistemic education. We mean education that does this, not that just teaches people how to become better technicians. It also means in our debates about people that we are prepared to learn, going back right to the start in 3 dimensions. Not only do we learn about the matter to hand, whatever it is, climate change or whatever, but we can also learn about how we learn about that. And we can get better at it. And then, relative to all that I've just been saying, we can learn about the limits to our learning and how they might actually be overridden. That's the rational part of us. There's another part, which, as I say, has become really evident to me working not just with Aboriginals, but with working cultures all over the world. And to me, it helps me to deal with the so-called science-religion debate. They're not wrong, either of them, necessarily. I always like Pascal's little 4 choices. There is a God, there isn't a God. I believe, I don't believe. 1 in 4 chances you're in real shtuck. The other 3 you can live with, as it were, or die with. This goes back to the 14th century. Bonaventura made the difference between sensual, conceptual and spiritual. You didn't quite call it that, but that's what he meant. We have an inner set of insights, whether they're God-given or not, that we can access through some process which is not rational in the sense that we can rationally sit down and do it and use those other 4 activities that we had before. So here's the final map that I leave you with. This is communicative action, a whole group of people experiencing, thinking, planning and acting together through multiple worldviews, calling increasingly upon whatever it is you want to call it. I call this experiential and this inspirational. We embed all of that as if it were a system, so we put a boundary around the idea of learning, and within it we set emotions and we set dispositions. You could call this intuition if you wish, you could call it accessing by meditation, contemplation, or whatever. In any event, it seems to me that the complete learner, the person, the citizen, who's going to really help us in a deliberative democracy to make judgments about these incredibly complex, messy issues, have to be people who are prepared to enter a form of learning that the academy is far removed from. This is not what we do. And certainly when I used to go to church, it didn't happen in church either. And it doesn't happen in meditative practice. They are so reductionist. So you go away, for instance, there are books written on planning. Well, planning's within a larger context. And thinking, there's books written about systems thinking, for instance. Well, thinking's just a bit. That, it seems to me, is being systemic. And I'm catching a plane. Goodbye.